I'm going to get started because this is the last session of the day. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. My name is Keil Eggers, and I'm going to be presenting on peace and conflict transformation. So our agenda is I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to myself, but also sort of what my world is, what the peace and conflict resolution ecosystem kind of looks like, with the main idea of just establishing that as you're thinking through some of the questions about technological development, how you can support things like collective sense making, how you can, I think you're going to talk about ideas like network states and things like that later on. Anytime you're designing some kind of technology to support the social system, you're going to have to deal with conflict, and as I believe that peace is one of the most important values that we have, and that understanding conflict can really, and the dynamics behind it, how it evolves, and what can happen, can really give you a lot of insight into all of the projects that you're doing. So, so by the end of the session, the main goal is I just want you to have baseline understanding of a few simple concepts, and then just know that there are plenty of things that you can ask me about later until the end of next week and after. So I just want to be a resource for all of you in this entire area. So we'll start off, and we'll kind of see what our baseline point is. This is like a real conflict 101 activity that we do, where everybody thinks of a metaphor of what's peace, what's conflict, what does that look like. Then I'll provide a top-down definition that you can use for analysis of conflict and peace. That's from some of Johann Galtung's work. Then we'll give you a very simple model of conflict dynamic, how things escalate and de-escalate, and what some of the activities would be that you would need to be engaged in throughout that conflict cycle. We'll raise some of the role that narrative plays. Again, very surface level. We'll be talking about this a lot more tomorrow. But I'll also throw out this idea of structural conflict, and what some of the ways that conflict can arise from the things that are unseen. Again, this will all be very surface level, and I hope to get into it more. So, just in terms of my background and what I'm going to bring into this, so I just finished my PhD in conflict analysis and resolution at the George Mason University Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. It's a very long name. But I've been, throughout all my academic life, been involved in conflict analysis and peace studies. So it is like a separate field, but it's a transdisciplinary field where we pull from sociology, political science, things like physics, psychology, whatever might be applicable to these cross-cutting issues. I have some project experience using SenseMaker as a technology to gather people's lived experiences and then understand how those are interacting with the SenseMaker approach. Again, I will talk about that at length tomorrow. And then I've also taught some courses on things like how you can do peace engineering with participatory approaches to narrative, use the actual tools, and then I've also been interested in the intersection with futures and foresight thinking. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about later. But I think the kind of three areas that I'm bringing that are a little bit unique to the field at large is that I'm really trying to develop, I've been calling it complexity-informed practice. So taking some of the understandings from complex adaptive systems theory, and specifically how humans deal with complex systems, and then creating different heuristics based on that complexity for practice, which again, I'll do a session on this tomorrow. The second is this idea of ethnographic peace research, which the basic thing behind that is that people's lived experience matters, and understanding how people interpret their lived experience gives you the raw material that you need to work in a conflict situation. Without that, your intervention is not going to be very useful. And then the third is dabbled in some mnemonic stuff, which we don't have to get into, but we can if anybody likes that. So I just wanted to notice too that there's so the Carter School is one of the best schools for this area, and so there's just a few, like, if any of these ideas are intriguing to you at all, I just wanted to point out that we have a Center for Peacemaking Practice, which has a large kind of database of practical examples of conflict and different case studies for the types of approaches that people have tried. So it's a huge area of experience that you can learn from as you're thinking about these issues. And Susan Allen is part of that. Recently, we also established the Center for Peace Tech and Entrepreneurship, which is kind of a spin-off of the Peace Engineering Lab that I was leading, which is going to be ideally incubating some applications of technology to peace. And then we also have a narrative transformation lab, which is focused on the role of narrative, how that affects conflict, how it evolves, and some of the ways that you can work on a narrative basis to change the relationships that people have. So those are just some kind of key areas. Happy to help everybody get to those later. So first off, everybody can take just like a minute or two and write down what your kind of main metaphor would be for understanding peace. On the one hand, like, what does peace look like to you? If you had to describe what peace was to somebody with a metaphor, what would you say? And then also do the same thing for conflict. Like, what's your metaphor for conflict?
Not a definition.
Not a definition, metaphor. So it'd be peace is like, conflict is like. Does everybody have one? Okay, yeah, do you want to start?
I would say peace is like a system in equilibrium where there are no drastic changes, and if a change happens, it's very gradual and not extreme.
Okay.
And instead, I would use for conflict like a chaotic system, like rapid changes happens, dramatic changes happens, and it's not stable.
Okay, so a little bit more of a definition there, but we'll let that go. Kate?
So I said peace is like two friends who are not mad at each other.
Okay.
And conflict is like two friends who are mad at each other.
All right.
Peace is like shaking hands.
Okay.
And like holding hands in the state, and conflict is like making fists with your hands.
Okay. Birds?
It wasn't that good.
No, go for it.
Like, I was using a chess game for conflict, but it's like not good because the conflict cannot be resolved without one winning or breaking the game completely.
Okay. Yeah, That's good. Good qualifier. Okay.
Some games are like that.
Yeah.
I have conflict is peace is taking turns to bake a pie, and conflict is fighting over the oven to bake a pie.
Okay.
So peace is like a garden, conflict is like a rainstorm.
Okay. Yeah.
Peace is a ship bound to a harbor and not on a stormy sea.
Okay. Safe harbor.
Or an unsafe harbor. Well, dictatorship would also be peace.
Okay.
Peace would be this like peaceful village with green colors and everyone happy faces, but conflict would depend on the seriousness of conflict. So conflict is not bad as such, but like if we're talking the opposite of peace, like war, then yeah, people fighting. But again, conflict can be constructive conflict, right? If it's just a disagreement that leads to something better without violence.
Yes. Peace is a dice no longer rolling, but falling on the side of stability.
What else you got? What do you think, Max?
Well, peace is easy. Peace is like forest meadow with waterfall. But conflict is, the metaphor I came in is not good for conflict. It's good for war, not for conflict.
What were you gonna go with? What were you gonna say?
No, because it's not good. Conflict is
That's
not
okay, that's
war. Conflict is disagreement. And disagreement is like
Yes.
Conflict are Lego blocks that just don't fit in each other because they have uninteroperable sizes of knobs.
Okay. so Legos from hell.
the conflict pieces not fitting together. Puzzle pieces not fitting together. It's a good definition, I think, for conflict.
Yes. So what are some of the things that you're noticing about the metaphors for peace? So we've got equilibrium, like a stable dice, two friends throwing out at each other, shaking hands, taking turns making pies, garden, and a ship in a harbor, a meadow with a waterfall. Okay.
Balance.
What?
Balance.
Yeah, balance.
More static.
Or static. Okay.
Flat water versus large base.
Agreement on a higher order.
Lights and colors.
Yeah, colors, yeah. It's actually a surprisingly common thing when people are asked to imagine peaceful images. And then what were some of the things that you noticed about the metaphors for conflict? So we had friends that were mad at each other, fighting over the oven, fists, chess game, rainstorm, war, and then the Lego blocks from hell.
Two sides.
Yeah, two sides.
Mostly something unpleasant.
Anger, not pleasant.
Disruption.
Disruption. Volatility.
It's annoying.
Yeah.
It's a problem where both sides cannot afford ignoring the problem.
Ignore. Yeah, so I think a lot of these are helpful just in establishing some of the basics behind it. I think I think at a basic level, if we're providing a definition of peace, and I want to say too, one of the things that's interesting about the peace metaphor idea is that every culture and every language also has its own peace definition. So there's like one school of peace studies that would just say that, your definition of peace is really going to be culturally determined because everybody has kind of a unique perspective toward it. This definition of peace is, I guess, the more Teutonic way of thinking about it from Johann Galtung, who's considered one of the founders of peace studies, and I think it can be helpful for doing the analysis. So really, peace is where you have fulfillment, you have the absence of suffering across various different spaces. And then the kind of key definition of conflict that we want to get across is that conflict is about incompatibility. So sometimes when you do this type of exercise, you get people, which I think this group is like slightly better about it, but a lot of times you get the definition of conflict as always being a negative thing or always being associated with violence. And so kind of like the first thing that we approach from peace studies perspective is that really all it means is that you have some kind of incompatible goal, but conflict can also be constructive, as Gordy said, it can be constructive and it can be transformed to produce a positive outcome. So conflict does not necessarily mean violence, but across anything that we're trying to do, from our perspective, violence is the thing to be most avoided, I would say. So the other kind of metaphor that I think can be carried through quite a bit in terms of understanding this is thinking of conflict from peace from a health perspective. So you could have when you're thinking of health and hygiene, how healthy you are is basically the amount of things that make you healthy over the things that make you unhealthy. It's a very simple thing. And so, you have things like, bacteria that can potentially make you unhealthy. And then you could have, factors like washing your hands that can help take care of that. And so I think one of the kind of basic things that you can start to think about is just in the same way that you would, have different routines to keep your body healthy, you can also have conflict hygiene, which are different types of practices where you can prevent conflict from becoming destructive and keep it constructive. So here is another, again, like Galtung's peace formula, which, again, is kind of like a top-down definitional way, but you can think about it as peace is equity and harmony over trauma and conflict. So when we say equity, that would mean that you can, have relationships where people can get benefit from it, and then harmony is the aspect of people moving together. And then your trauma, basically you have trauma anytime that there's violence, and that would be the one of the worst things about violence is that it creates a lot of uncertainty and instability because you carry it around with you, and the kind of negative impact of that can come out in a variety of different ways. And so conflict is also the way that when you have incompatibility of goals. So kind of your areas of work are you can first off try and reduce or transform the parts that are on the bottom. So you can help people to heal their trauma or reconcile their past trauma in their relationships with other people. You can work to resolve or transform conflicts to make them more constructive. Or you can create the conditions for more equitable relationships between people and also harmony. And there's so kind of a big picture definition. There's a lot of activities that could go in between that.
A question on this formula. So does it really mean that in most cases our world is in the kind of conflict kind of phase, and piece is a subset of the complex times trauma.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, is it like
Is it just like mathematically bad?
No, I'm just saying like that doesn't mean like the piece actually comes from the conflict, because the conflict and trauma is like the normal case, and then only if you have the equity and the harmony creates the piece. And it sounds like piece is a subset of that.
Well, I think if you have like a lot more trauma and like negative conflict within the system, then that would like lessen the amount of peace that you have. Does that make sense? Right?
Got it, yeah.
You can also like express conflict through the formula which includes peace. You can reverse it.
That's
It goes both ways.
that's right. Yeah.
I think that it might be necessary to talk a bit for this formula about the prerequisites to really use it, because the world of total peace would also be very boring then, and like a X-risk outcome, even like us all trapped in happy boxes would be that peace. For example, or us losing agency to even see conflict at hand, because it doesn't matter, we're all happy, opium. So I think that peace is not a positive word, but really just like these formulas here in function. And should we imagine peace when we look at that on a personal level, on a subjective level, or on a like nation-state level, like North Korea is probably at peace. At the same time, like the Vatican is inherently at war.
So I think there's definitely, I think internally you can have different conceptions of peace as well, in terms of like how that affects you as an individual. So like there is a scholar that like is a Wolfgang Dietrich who talks about like peace in terms of like at the interpersonal level or just inside yourself. You have that kind of idea of like peace as the inner lake or like the inner calm that you can achieve potentially. But when you're looking at like, I don't know, basically I think that this is kind of a helpful way to look like at the grand components of like some of what's involved in the work. And I think that the other thing that's important to remember is that these are all like really dynamic processes too. So I think like one of the other things that we say is like conflict is the other thing that always exists besides death and taxes, right? So one of the constants that we always have, and there's always a dynamism within it. And so because of that, because there's always going to be incompatible goals, and for various different reasons, the diversity of just kind of our human nature, there's always going to be like piecework to try and improve one of these aspects, I would say. So you would,
To this question, like, is there an implicit sort of assumption here that we're trying to maximize this, trying to maximize peace, and that's going to be a good thing, or?
I would say yes. So this, going back to our conversation earlier, Tom. So just like you were saying, like your kind of core value would be maximizing knowledge. I would say mine as a peace scholar would be maximizing peace as like a universal good that we should be most concerned with.
That was sort of the happy box, or
but it's not
drugs would maximize that formula, or
no, I don't think so. Because it's not just existing in soma, like taking a.
But if we minimize trauma or conflict to basically zero, which would send it to infinity.
But
it would minimize
harmony as well. It would minimize harmony because that's not harmony, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter because we're all zero.
Well, so I think like there's some other like frameworks to think about this too. But like if you think about like a kind of positive version of peace, so aside from just mitigating violence on the one hand. So like we have a distinction between positive peace and negative peace that's made often. So negative peace would be like at a basic level that you don't have acts of violence that are occurring. And so like, for example, when the war starts, one of the first things that you have to do is try and get people to stop shooting each other. But then there's a whole other level of like how you're reestablishing relationships where people can cooperate and benefit from each other. So peace, doesn't need to be a stagnant thing where just you're sitting there and you just feel good all the time. But think about like how it is when you're like with your best friend, for example, and you're like achieving things together. You're moving along the same trajectory. The things that you do benefit the other person, and vice versa. And so by kind of establishing that, you can still have a lot of dynamism in your life.
Is what you're talking about the same or different than, say, like voluntary peace versus enforced peace?
Could you say what you mean a little bit more about that?
Well, like voluntary peace would mean like I don't have any ill will or animosity or want to express like violence towards you, say, and enforced peace would be like maybe I have to suppress a tendency I would otherwise engage in for some external reason.
I think there's a possibility there for sure. I mean,
I'm just wondering, is there a distinction between the way you would talk about positive and negative peace based on versus voluntary and involuntary or sort of enforced peace?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're at the point where it's like a mutually beneficial, equitable relationship, then that's not something you have to like force somebody to do, I think.
Can we say that peace and conflicts reverse proportionally? So like peace equals 1 divided by conflict. Then we can shorten this one.
I'll just...
It will be 1.
I'm just gonna say no. Okay, I'm gonna get us out of this path now because I feel like we're getting So and like a bunch of books that like dive into like deeper elements of what that formula is. I think the main thing is like just in terms of the roles that we can play. So we can try and have equity. We can try and build harmony in the ways that like something positive happening for somebody is something positive happening for another person. And so we want to resolve. Yeah.
What is equity? Like, how are you defining equity?
So equity would be like so if you think of like harmony as like a direction of travel, that we are like going in the same direction, then equity would be a question of rate.
What?
Of like the rate, right?
Is it something like
Fast
utilitarian
or
measure with like?
No, I don't think so. I think no, I don't think it's necessarily like a utilitarian thing. I think basically that just that you can have similar movement in the direction that there's not like as much disparity in terms of the effects. But I also, again, don't think that this is necessarily the part that we need to get super hung up on in terms of the formula. It's like not the main point I'm trying to get across.
Can I just ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
Would you say that an ant hive, is it called hive or just a beehive? Like the ants, one ant colony, are they having equity? Because they so covert, so frictionless with each other, where humans with more nuanced wants and needs for and more conflict potential are not.
I guess
that
I
sounds more like high harmony to me.
I guess there's equity within it.
So it's
Harmony in terms of their role, I guess. But also, I think your point on human beings aren't ants is also very important.
But we could turn into some or we can go into even more higher beings that have even more conflict potential. So that is variable.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think a lot of conflict does develop because of the kind of like the nature of the bodies that we're in and our emotional responses to things, and the way that, like, if we didn't, for example, if we had a different potential for how our body was impacted by traumatic events, we might have a much different conflict space that we'd be working in, because it would be carried around differently. I'm gonna skip some of these other charts and stuff because I think I don't want to get too mired in that. So here's another kind of very basic conflict escalation type of diagram. I don't necessarily agree with most of it. The reason that I wanted to bring this up is just to show you, like, again, the range of types of activities that you can have. So in an escalation cycle, you generally can see this kind of curve shape. So the part at the top of that would be where you have the most polarized conflict. Then at the bottom would be where you have kind of more, it's a de-escalated conflict. So it's an escalation curve that we're seeing here. And you can see that as that you can have like a kind of preventative angle where before conflict gets very polarized, there's a whole range of activities to try and prevent that from happening. So that might be this has this I think is more of like a State Department E type of graph, just not necessarily the stuff that I'm like a specialist in either. So I just want to admit that. And then you can have the kind of outbreak of violence, and then after that, you have to stop the violence, and then you can start to do increased like peace building activities or trying to do the trauma healing and the reconciliation work. The part that I wanted to point out more, that I think is interesting on the escalation curve, is when you start off in a conflict situation, there's a lot of different there's diversity and possibility. So the kind of idea that I want to get across is that as a conflict escalates, what kind of naturally happens is that energy within your conflict system becomes polarized on 2 points of view. So is everybody, you've heard like the phrase us against them before, right? One of my favorite songs has a lyric that's, this is a war we can't win. After 10,000 years, it's still us against them. And I think that really summarizes a lot of just like the kind of final state of conflict, that no matter like who people are, once things polarize, it can become just a simple us against them. And even though there might be a large amount of issues that are involved in a conflict at the very beginning, the things that people care about, what kind of happens is that those ideas become put into a blob. So even just thinking about the activity that we did in the gym, where we had to go to one side or the other, and then we had a conversation where we actually got to find out that there's a whole lot of other stuff that's going into that. When we're forced to make a choice, we have to go to one side or the other. And so basically, there's attractors that form on both sides of the conflict, and you start to have those attractor states grow and grow and grow, so that it kind of draws people there. And then a lot of the peace building is trying to kind of weaken those attractors or create an alternative possibility space again. And we've talked, I think this also comes up, especially within narrative and conflict. So as a conflict escalates, your narrative space also shrinks. So the types of like stories that you can tell about it, or the things that you can say, really become limited, and because you can get punished for if you kind of complexify a narrative a little bit, then that can be mistaken as being on the other side, and the other aspect of it is that you have to have a really simple narrative for a conflict to be polarized. Because if you actually state the reality of how complex the dynamics are and all the different needs and goals and things that people have, then you can't have such a concentration of energy on both sides. So from the narrative perspective, and this is a really good book on that, speaking of violence, and I just want to say it's a lot less and I have no idea, I'll see at dinner, I guess, over some wine, like how hippy-dippy and impractical this might seem to some of you. But I think in a very pragmatic sense, it's like these are dynamics that really happen in reality, and you can tend to them and do things like increasing the complexity of the narratives that people share about conflict, about rewriting different narratives to give legitimacy to different points of view and different possibilities, and to give people agency and ability to change without getting sucked into these conflict detractors, and that can be a really important force in de-escalating conflict. So definitely check that out. Let's see. Okay. So let's see here. So just another thing that I think is interesting to think about is the notion of structural conflict. So you can think about like one of the things that can really drive conflict are underlying structures or systems that can create patterns of violence over time. And what's really challenging about structural conflicts is that nobody agrees on what they are because the forces behind them are invisible. So if you say, I don't know, like if somebody was talking about the structural, gave a structural analysis of capitalism, for example, then inevitably, once they say, oh, what's preventing people from meeting their basic needs, and it's destroying the planet, and it's creating these like cycles of resource conflict over time. But then on the other side, you can say, no, it's not doing that. It's creating growth, and it's helping connect people across the world. You could come up with this for basically any kind of structural analysis. So the issues that come up with resolving structural conflict is you have the pattern of partisan disagreement. So because there's not necessarily an explicit problem or a way to prove that your analysis is the right one, then you can just continually get some kind of partisan deadlock over what that is. And they're kind of unknowable by nature. So this is one area which I think I just wanted to bring this up because I think tomorrow the sense-making conversation and some of the software that we're showing, one of the kind of hopes that I think we can have for sense-making technology is that it can help render some of these structural conflicts more explicit, or at least make it easier to talk about what people's lived experiences are and how they're perceiving it, to kind of put more light on what the distribution of thought around structural conflicts are, so that then you can have a better strategy and understanding of it, and get out of the trap around just disagreeing about the fundamental nature of what's going on. Let's see.
Well, may I ask something?
Yeah, sure.
What about trauma could be similar to structural conflict? Like, is there any relationship between that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so trauma is So I guess like the way that trauma is discussed a lot right now in terms of overall discourse is that it's like stored in the body, right? So you can have a traumatic event happen to you, and then it can actually change the structure of your brain and the way that you're processing information, and so you carry that around with you. And so in a way, the trauma becomes part of the structural condition of your cognition and your body system, your body structure. Which is also why it can be pretty important to surface what that is and work with it. What does everybody else think on that?
I thought about more like societal trauma and like societal structural conflicts.
Yeah.
Not on an individual level, but on a collective level.
I think it's not trauma then, but rather fracture of society that is maybe a different word.
Yeah, so I mean, there's some really good work on the kind of like collective trauma as well, and memory is a really big area. So after one of the there's one book on that by a psychologist named Namek Volkan, who's talks about chosen trauma and the way that a collective trauma can be mobilized for an entire group of people to kind of rally around it, understand their history in one way, and then engage in conflict or protect themselves given that trauma. And I think it's definitely there's like a lot of work on collective memory too, on how people share, reproduce stories of trauma that happened to them that could affect society.
What I think that this is one of the main problems in the whole discussion, that we would accept these statements of collective trauma or collective history, because this is literally groupthink. If you are born into some identity that the identity group pushes onto you, that you have to sign up to the problem statements that not the individuals of the identity group push onto you, but the blind demon of groupthink, nearly Molochian extremities that wants that for you. And I think that like the lived experience that was either one slide before is maybe for that reason not the real answer, but rather disagreement with grand narratives dictating the whole discussion. And that can happen without lived experience before that. That can happen with cognitive sovereignty as the basis of criticism itself. Without having to live the truth to criticize it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think part of when we're talking about the concepts like collective trauma, they're social phenomena that happen, and as you say, it's not necessarily desirable that trauma is passed down. And so a lot of the work that is done is that you have to engage with it. You do need to think of just because my grandparents suffered this, do I want to still think of the group that caused it as an enemy? That's still true for me. I think that there's a lot of possibility within the kind of frameworks that you're talking about to resist some of the negative impacts of that.
I would even say the opposite. I think that you should not have to engage with it. It should not play any role what happened in collective history or so.
I strongly disagree, because what if it happened and the other group is still against you for help, then it's really important that you remember.
Okay, then yes.
That's exactly the problem, right? It depends again on the context, whether it's a good narrative and if it has a function, like it protects you against an ongoing group that still intends to do the same things, then it's a super important narrative to have, because you are ongoingly in this narrative that is still happening in real, right? So you can't just say, oh, just like forget it, because it's the same as for the individual, right? Like memory matters because it might still teach you something about reality, and if that's still relevant for the world you find yourself in, then it's extremely important also as a group right? Like have a certain identity. Like for example, I mean, if you think about, for example, like a Jewish identity, which is often is like repressed, right? Like a story of like what has happened in the past. Well, now the question is like, should they still think about themselves like that? And then you have to look around and say like, well, there's still people that are extremely anti-Semitic, right? That's also a fact of reality. So you can say, well, just drop the victim narrative already. But then again, there are many people that do really hate Jewish people. So, but like keeping it alive is just also actually useful because it reminds you that there are people that hate you, right? So it's just like, not so simple to just throw it out.
Yeah.
Because it's also the other group that forces you to do things.
Just reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think even from a really abstract perspective, right, a complex system, every complex system has a history and interactions between the parts that then create new emerging conditions, right? And social systems have history, groups of people have history, and a lot of that is about the kind of collective memory and the stories that we tell. And so I think, yeah, I mean, the question is always like, is this kind of serving us or not, as you were saying? But it is also just like a fact, because we have we have culture and part of groups, right? Unless there's any like real one of individuals here that have a social group identity, should maybe
do my best.
So.
It's really interesting. But because trauma is ultimately it's just another idea that you have. I guess we call it trauma because it's an idea that was sort of in some way forced on you against your will. Like you didn't choose to adopt that idea, you were forced to choose it through your upbringing or through some experience. And just like any idea, it can serve you or it can not serve you. It can be useful or not, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of just like we talk about conflict, how it can be transformative. There's people that undergo terrible traumas, and then are able to turn that into a positive, constructive aspect in their life after they've healed. But that's kind of like the healing aspect of it. So there's, and again, in all of these things that I'm presenting a extremely simplified and probably inadequate version from even what I think, just because I've didn't, it's not like premeditating the session for a very long time. But I think that there's a lot of diversity within the field as well in terms of how people are thinking about trauma in terms of the types of solutions that they're creating. One of the things that's most I think interesting, but also difficult about the field is just the range of activities and the types of theories that you can bring to bear on it. So every different conflict resolver, peace builder will have like a unique approach that they bring to it, and it might be more centered in one area, but we'll have we'll have alternative theories about what we've done. So we can deal with all the rest later. So I think just kind of in a parting thought, and we can go to dinner. But I think this is helpful is thinking about kind of three aspects of this whole business, which I think are values that can be carried forward in whatever you're doing. That's having empathy, nonviolence, and creativity as kind of being central values to the entire endeavor of peace building or conflict transformation, and just recognizing that it's always a never-ending process. That is something that we always have to tend to. We always have to be recognizing as we live, as movements happen, as violence occurs, as traumas are endured, as friendships are had, right? That we're always engaging in a really dynamic system of peace, and that we're always able to positively intervene in cycles of conflict and violence as well. So the kind of just like main takeaway, really, if we weren't already there, was that conflict is incompatibility. It's always going to be there. It's not necessarily something that needs to be bad. And there are lots of different tools and kind of methods to help contribute to a more peaceful world. And it's not just the idea of always feeling happy or always feeling good, but it's really about creating those relationships that are equitable and harmonious. And I think in terms of just to kind of bring it all back here in terms of what I'm understanding the main objective of ZuVillage is in terms of establishing new communities that are based on common interests and consent and sovereignty and so on. Whenever you're dealing with all those people coming together with different goals and trying to seek some kind of alignment, just kind of understanding that the conflict is going to occur in those processes and trying to do some thinking about how to make sure that you have conflict resolution mechanisms is incredibly important. So I will end it there, and as I said, I think I'm happy to be a resource for anybody that wants to get away from just the kind of simplistic formulas and wants to do a little bit of deeper dive into some of what this is. Got a ton of reading I can share with you, and happy to talk with you as well. So thanks so much.